The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BC by the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, stands as the most poignant symbol of knowledge lost to history. It was not merely a repository of scrolls, it was the world's first and most ambitious universal research institute, known as the Museion, or Seat of the Muses. Located in the heart of the Hellenistic world's most vibrant city, its mission was audacious: to collect a copy of every book ever written. At its zenith, the library held an estimated 40,000 to 400,000 scrolls, depending on the accounting method, attracting the greatest minds of the ancient world. The true tragedy of the library lies not just in its physical destruction, a slow, complex process spanning several centuries, but in the irreplaceable loss of its contents. This loss has given rise to the myth of forbidden knowledge, the idea that the scrolls contained secrets so profound, so dangerous, or so far ahead of their time that their obliteration fundamentally stalled the progress of human civilization. The destruction of this knowledge wasn't a single event. It was a series of catastrophes, starting with Julius Caesar's accidental fire in 48 BC and culminating in subsequent Roman, Christian, and Arab purges. The Ptolemaic royal mandate was the initial engine of this massive intellectual collection. The kings employed extraordinary and sometimes ruthless methods to acquire texts. One famous account describes how every ship docking in Alexandria was searched, and any scrolls found were confiscated, copied by the library scribes, and the copies returned to the owners, while the original, superior texts were retained by the library. Furthermore, Ptolemy III even famously borrowed the original scripts of Greek tragedians, like Sophocles and Euripides, from Athens, promising a massive deposit of silver, only to forfeit the silver and keep the priceless originals. This aggressive acquisition strategy ensured that the library housed not just second-hand copies, but the authenticated masterworks of classical antiquity, often annotated and studied by the scholars who lived and worked within the Museion complex.
The true intellectual power of the library resided within the Museion itself, which functioned as a state-sponsored academy for the most brilliant minds of the Hellenistic world. Scholars, or fellows, were housed, fed, and paid generous salaries by the Ptolemaics, allowing them to dedicate their entire lives to research and discovery without the constraint of earning a living. This concentration of genius led to breakthroughs that were arguably centuries ahead of their time, creating the very forbidden knowledge that was later lost. The scrolls held the theoretical proofs, but the Museion held the living, breathing intellectual tradition. One of the most significant areas of loss is in ancient mechanics and engineering. While figures like Archimedes and Ctesibius are known for their practical inventions, such as the screw pump and the water clock, the library likely housed detailed treatises on far more complex, potentially industrial-scale technologies. These lost texts might have contained the blueprints for advanced automated machines, complex gear systems, or even steam-powered devices that could have initiated an early form of industrial revolution in the 1st century BC. The prevailing political structure, which relied heavily on cheap slave labor, often meant that such labor-saving technology was deemed impractical or politically destabilizing, contributing to the knowledge being shelved and eventually forgotten or suppressed. The field of astronomy and cosmology also suffered an irreparable loss. Scholars like Hipparchus, who compiled the first comprehensive star catalog and developed trigonometric methods, relied on the library's massive collection of Babylonian and Egyptian astronomical data. The library's scrolls likely contained detailed astronomical tables and cosmological models far more precise than those that survived. Perhaps most critically, the original, complete works of Aristarchus of Samos, who first proposed the heliocentric model of the solar system, placing the sun, not the Earth, at the center, were housed here. When later, religiously conservative regimes favored the simpler geocentric, earth-centered model of Ptolemaios, Aristarchus's more accurate, radical theory, the very model that Copernicus would rediscover 1800 years later, was systematically ignored. Its supporting texts allowed to decay, thus delaying a fundamental shift in scientific understanding for almost 2 millennia. The sheer volume of lost historical texts is staggering. The library held unique records of the early Phoenician voyages, complete works on the history of Egypt and the Near East, and countless eyewitness accounts of the Persian Wars and the conquests of Alexander the Great that do not survive today. The destruction of these texts means we lost not only valuable historical detail, but also the diverse perspectives of the ancient world. The resulting gap in our knowledge is a chasm that modern historians can only attempt to bridge with frustratingly fragmented sources, solidifying the idea that the library's destruction wiped out not just books, but a complete, complex record of human endeavor.
The most enduring and perhaps most tragic loss associated with the Library of Alexandria pertains to the vast body of work in medicine and anatomy. The Mauseon fostered a revolutionary era in medical science, led by figures like Herophilus and Erasistratus. These scholars conducted systematic and controversial dissections of human cadavers, a practice strictly forbidden in later Roman and medieval societies due to religious and moral prohibitions. Their detailed anatomical texts, which included precise descriptions of the nervous system, the function of the brain as the center of intellect, challenging Aristotle's view of the heart, and the circulation of blood, were housed in the library. The subsequent suppression of human dissection, enforced first by Roman conservatism and later by religious dogma, meant that this Alexandrian knowledge was not just lost, but actively reversed. For over 1,000 years, Western medicine relied primarily on the incomplete and often incorrect findings of Galen, the 2nd century AD, whose work, though brilliant, was limited by his reliance on animal dissections. The total loss of the Alexandrian anatomical treatises meant that doctors remained ignorant of basic human physiology until the Renaissance, when pioneers like Vesalius were forced to start the process of human dissection and anatomical mapping almost from scratch. The forbidden knowledge of the human body, once mastered in Alexandria, became the knowledge most urgently needed and most violently suppressed in the medieval era. Furthermore, the library held unique texts on advanced mathematics and geometry, while figures like Euclid, known for his elements, and Apollonius, known for his work on conic sections, are remembered because some of their work survived. The library held their complete and annotated collections. It is highly probable that lost texts contained complex solutions to advanced calculus problems, non-Euclidean geometries, or early concepts of applied algebra that were only independently developed in the Islamic Golden Age or in Renaissance Europe. The loss of these foundational mathematical building blocks created a deep, structural void in subsequent academic traditions, forcing later scholars to spend centuries re-deriving proofs and rediscovering fundamental concepts. The destruction of the library, therefore, was not a simple accident. It was a historical lobotomy. It wasn't just the burning of scrolls, but the successful erasure of the intellectual momentum that Alexandrian scholars had meticulously built. The subsequent Dark Ages saw a regression in almost every scientific field, a regression that the forbidden rational knowledge of the Mauseon could have prevented. The enduring myth is not that the books held magic, but that they held the uncomfortable truth of human potential, a truth that successive powers found easier to destroy than to integrate. The tantalizing suggestions of advanced forgotten technology constitute a core component of the forbidden knowledge myth. The Mauseon was home to figures who bridged the gap between theoretical physics and practical engineering. Historians believe that the library housed the complete works of Hero of Alexandria, 1st century AD, a brilliant engineer whose surviving texts describe mechanisms such as the Aeolipile, a primitive steam engine, and complex pneumatic and hydraulic devices. If the complete works of Hero and his contemporaries, like Philo of Byzantium, had survived, we might possess the blueprints for far more intricate machines, perhaps early computing devices, highly efficient clockworks, or even automated military weaponry that could have drastically altered the course of late antiquity. The reason this technological knowledge became forbidden is rooted in the social structure of the ancient world. The Alexandrian intellectual class was largely isolated from the industrial application of their discoveries. Their inventions were viewed primarily as toys or curiosities for the elite, designed for temple ceremonies like automated doors or singing statues, rather than for manufacturing or mass production. This lack of industrial motivation, coupled with the prevalence of slave labor, meant the economic incentive to develop these technologies was absent. When the political and intellectual patronage of the Ptolemies and Romans waned, these practical treatises, which lacked the spiritual protection of religious texts or the literary value of poetry, were the first to be neglected, becoming the most vulnerable to destruction. The knowledge was forbidden, not by decree, but by economic apathy and a lack of social utility. The library's alleged possession of alchemical and protochemical texts is another rich area of speculation. Alexandria was a melting pot of Egyptian metallurgical knowledge and Greek philosophical inquiry, giving birth to early chemistry. The lost scrolls likely contained sophisticated techniques for dye production, glass coloring, alloy creation, including methods for faking gold, and early theories on the composition of matter. This proto-science, often intertwined with mysticism and later viewed as dangerous magic by succeeding monotheistic cultures, was a prime candidate for suppression. The fear of knowledge that could radically alter the value of materials or challenge divine creation narratives led to the deliberate elimination of these ancient chemical texts. The few surviving fragments suggest a level of material science far exceeding the capabilities of the early medieval period. The legacy of the library is a haunting reminder that progress is not linear. The forbidden knowledge was not just theoretical, it was tangible and operational. Its disappearance highlights a catastrophic moment in human history when the intellectual momentum of the Hellenistic Golden Age was consciously or accidentally sacrificed at the altar of political instability, religious orthodoxy, and social stagnation, leaving the subsequent world to struggle for centuries to regain the heights once achieved on the shores of the Nile.
The political dimension of the library's demise is crucial to understanding the true nature of the suppression. The first, most infamous event was the fire initiated by Julius Caesar in 48 BC. While Caesar's official accounts downplayed the damage, attributing the fire to necessary military tactics during his siege of Alexandria. Historians believe the fire destroyed a massive adjacent warehouse or port facility, which, tragically, was being used to store a large portion of the library's overflow scrolls or a recent significant acquisition. This initial disaster was an unintended yet profound architectural and intellectual blow that significantly reduced the total collection, creating a major fracture in the library's comprehensive record. It marked the first time that pure military expediency was prioritized over the safeguarding of human knowledge. However, Caesar's fire was only the beginning of a long, drawn-out intellectual decline. The subsequent Roman emperors maintained the library, but the intense intellectual patronage of the Ptolemies was never fully restored. The political stability that enabled the Musan to function as an isolated research sanctuary began to erode. The most deliberate and significant loss occurred later, during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, a period of intense religious and civil conflict.
The destruction was often driven by religious zealotry. Pagan, Greek, and earlier Babylonian texts were increasingly viewed as heretical, corrupting, or dangerously demonic by the growing power of Christian authorities. The infamous destruction of the Serapeum, the massive daughter library located within the Temple of Serapis in 391 AD, is a grim milestone. Led by the Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria, this event saw Christian zealots actively dismantle and destroy the temple complex, which included the Serapeum's collection. This was not an accidental fire. It was a deliberate, targeted act of cultural and religious purification. The books and scrolls within the Serapeum likely contained the last significant copies of pagan philosophy, astronomy, and theology. Their destruction solidified the victory of a singular, dominant worldview over the pluralistic, syncretic intellectualism of the Hellenistic age. The knowledge became forbidden because it represented a competing spiritual and philosophical narrative, one that threatened the established religious order of the late Roman Empire. The library's story is thus a chilling parable about intellectual vulnerability. It shows that even the most well-funded and globally ambitious centers of learning can be destroyed by a combination of military mishap, financial neglect, and ultimately the intentional suppression of knowledge deemed politically or theologically inconvenient. The forbidden knowledge was the light of rational inquiry that successive dark ages sought to extinguish.
One of the most profound losses, the details of which have fueled centuries of speculation regarding the forbidden knowledge, relates to philosophy and moral science. The library housed the complete, unexpurgated works of the classical Greek philosophers, including the early radical texts of the pre-Socratics such as Democritus and Heraclitus, whose materialist and atomic theories directly challenged later Platonic and Aristotelian metaphysics, and certainly the emerging monotheistic doctrines. Democritus's work on atomism, which proposed that the universe was composed of indivisible, eternal particles moving in a void, was a powerful, purely secular explanation of the cosmos that negated the need for divine intervention in creation. When the library's influence faded, these materialist philosophies became increasingly marginalized. Later religious philosophers often found it necessary to selectively edit, reinterpret, or simply destroy texts that promoted a godless, mechanistic view of the universe. The loss of the comprehensive debates and counterarguments within the library means that the later Western world inherited a heavily curated philosophical tradition, one where rational, materialist inquiry was deliberately suppressed in favor of dogmatic theological explanations. The forbidden knowledge here was not about technology, but about the fundamental freedom of inquiry and the right to propose a purely rational, non-spiritual model of existence. The library was also a repository for texts related to non-Greek cultures, particularly Egyptian and Babylonian histories, mathematics, and occult practices. The inclusion of these vast, often hieroglyphic or cuneiform archives meant that the Mauseon scholars were engaging in true cross-cultural studies, translating and integrating knowledge systems from across the Near East. The loss of these unique translations, many of which were the only complete Greek interpretations of ancient Egyptian religious and scientific texts, destroyed a crucial link to thousands of years of pre-Hellenistic knowledge. When the library was destroyed, the ability to fluently read and understand ancient Egyptian and Babylonian texts quickly faded, leading to the misinterpretation and subsequent relegation of these ancient wisdom traditions to the realm of mere superstition or magic. This intellectual isolation ensured that the knowledge became forbidden simply because the key to translation was burned.
The tragic dispersal of this forbidden knowledge was a slow cultural amputation, leaving the world poorer in every field. The library's fate serves as the most powerful historical warning. The loss of knowledge is not merely a setback. It is the deliberate silencing of alternative voices and the successful enforcement of a narrowed, homogenized version of reality. The darkness that followed was the shadow of the knowledge that had been extinguished. The geographical and mathematical sciences represent another colossal void created by the library's destruction, leaving the Western world blind to the true dimensions of its own planet for centuries. The Mouseion was home to Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who served as the library's chief librarian in the 3rd century BC. Eratosthenes achieved the first scientifically accurate calculation of the Earth's circumference with astonishing precision, using basic geometry and observations of the sun's angle at 2 different locations, Cyrene and Alexandria. His method, which yielded a result incredibly close to modern measurements, was not merely a standalone fact. It was part of a vast compendium of applied geodesy, the science of measuring and representing the Earth. The complete documentation of his work, including the underlying astronomical and mathematical tables, was housed in the library. The loss of these texts meant that subsequent generations either ignored Eratosthenes' work entirely or relied on far less accurate approximations. For instance, the later, less precise circumference calculations of Posidonius were favored, and these, in turn, heavily influenced Ptolemy's, the 2nd century AD geographer, not the king, geographical work, which significantly underestimated the size of the Earth. This fundamental error, the intentional or accidental adoption of a smaller Earth model, had staggering historical consequences. It was the miscalculation derived from the loss of the original Alexandrian texts that gave Christopher Columbus the confidence, 1,700 years later, to sail west, mistakenly believing Asia was within easy reach. Had the accurate Alexandrian geodetic data survived and been respected, the age of exploration might have unfolded very differently, perhaps with a more cautious and less immediate push across the Atlantic. Moreover, the library held the complete, magnificent collection of maps and cartographic treatises compiled by generations of Alexandrian scholars who integrated data from Alexander the Great's campaigns, Phoenician sea voyages, and diplomatic missions across India, Africa, and the Silk Road. These maps were far more accurate and comprehensive than anything available in the European Dark Ages. They likely detailed coastlines, trade winds, and complex global geography that was utterly lost when the library's cartographic wing, a specialized section known as the Pinnacase for its cataloging systems, was damaged or destroyed. The forbidden knowledge here was the accurate knowledge of the world itself, which, when lost, allowed fear, superstition, and ignorance to fill the geographical void, literally shrinking the perceived world and isolating Europe for a millennium. The systematic cataloging of the library's collection, initially developed by Callimachus, was itself a groundbreaking feat. His Pinnacase was the first known comprehensive library catalog, an organized, subject-based index of the world's knowledge. While not a scroll of forbidden knowledge in the mythical sense, the loss of the Pinnacase was catastrophic for modern historians and scholars as it destroyed the only true index of what the ancient world actually knew. We do not mourn just the loss of the books, but the loss of the map to the knowledge, forcing us to rely on fragmented citations and references to guess the extent of ancient intellectual achievement. The structural destruction of the metadata meant that even if a few scattered scrolls survived the purges, their context and relationship to the larger body of Alexandrian thought were forever severed.
The loss of knowledge within the library's massive collection extended deeply into the realm of military science, logistics, and naval architecture, areas that were critically important to the Ptolemaic dynasty's dominance, but which later military powers had to painfully rediscover. The library likely housed the complete technical treatises on advanced siege warfare, including detailed blueprints for colossal war machines, such as the Helepolis, known as the City Taker, and the highly complex torsion artillery developed by engineers like Ctesibius. These texts would have detailed the precise engineering required to harness immense spring power using twisted animal sinew, allowing for greater range and accuracy than anything seen in the medieval era. The disappearance of this comprehensive manual for military engineering left later civilizations to rely on crude, simplified designs, arguably stalling the development of effective long-range weaponry until the advent of gunpowder. Furthermore, the library maintained exhaustive records on Ptolemaic naval technology, which allowed Egypt to command the Mediterranean for centuries. These scrolls would have included detailed plans for the construction of colossal polyremes, multi-banked warships like the Tessaracontaires, or a massive vessel requiring thousands of oarsmen, and sophisticated treatises on ship stability, hydrodynamics, and advanced sail design. The loss of this applied nautical science meant that when Europe finally began its own naval expansion centuries later, it had to rely on less efficient, less stable ship designs, lacking the deep theoretical understanding of wave dynamics and hull construction once commonplace in Alexandrian dockyards. The practical secrets of Ptolemaic naval supremacy became, quite literally, forbidden knowledge to the struggling maritime powers that followed. Another crucial area of loss was ancient signaling and communication. The library contained records of advanced optical and phonetic signaling systems, mechanisms that allowed for the rapid transmission of complex military or administrative messages across vast distances, often using sequences of torches, coded flags, or sophisticated hydraulic telegraphs. These systems represented a protoform of the information network necessary to manage a sprawling empire. Their destruction meant that effective communication reverted to slow, vulnerable courier systems for 1,000 years, significantly impeding governance, trade, and military coordination across the post-Roman world. The ability to transmit complex data rapidly, a core component of modern civilization, was thus lost due to the destruction of these technological manuals.
The narrative of the library's destruction often overlooks the desperate, clandestine efforts made by scholars to save the most valuable and dangerous scrolls, the true forbidden knowledge. This was the knowledge that challenged fundamental beliefs, texts too volatile to be allowed to fall into the hands of zealots. It is in this context of intellectual siege that the most compelling stories of preservation and heartbreaking loss emerge. Consider the fate of the last great Alexandrian scholars during the period of the Serapeans' destruction in the late 4th century. The final, fierce guardian of that pagan intellectual tradition was the brilliant mathematician and philosopher Hypatia. Hypatia taught the rationalist, often Neoplatonic philosophies that were deeply rooted in the Mausian's traditions. Her teaching was an act of defiance against the growing tide of religious intolerance. She became a lightning rod for the conflict, her eventual horrific murder in 415 AD, symbolizing the final, violent triumph of dogma over reason in the city. But the real, untold story lies with her students. We are forced to ask, in the weeks leading up to the final fatal riots, did Hypatia and her disciples manage to smuggle out the most precious keys to ancient technology and philosophy? Imagine this scene, the night of the Red Scrolls. A young, devoted student of Hypatia, a Roman named Philon, volunteers for the final, most dangerous task.
The Serapeum is locked down, but Philon knows a hidden drainage tunnel, a secret route used centuries earlier. He slips past the increasingly volatile mobs gathering outside. His mission is not to save all the philosophy, but one single, invaluable chest. This chest contains the key to the seven arts, a legendary leather-bound volume that holds the unified theory of Tucídides and Hero, the engineering manuals detailing advanced optics, fluid dynamics, and the precise mathematical models for building perpetual motion devices, or perhaps even a working prototype of a computational mechanism. This chest, heavy with the forbidden truth of a purely mechanical universe, is too precious to burn. Philon, risking his life, manages to pull the heavy water-slick chest through the sewer network, emerging hours later, battered but triumphant, on a desolate beach outside the city walls. He seals the chest in resin and loads it onto a waiting Phoenician vessel, bound not for the collapsing West, but for Persia, the only remaining civilization with the curiosity and stability to value such rational knowledge. Philon sacrifices his identity and future, becoming a quiet, anonymous traveling scholar, the solitary carrier of the world's most dangerous secrets, destined to introduce this forbidden knowledge into the burgeoning intellectual centers of the East, ensuring its survival, if not its immediate use. This story, whether fully literal or simply illustrative of the scholar's desperation, embodies the hope that the most profound knowledge was not lost, but transferred. It was forbidden not because it was burned, but because it was secretly exported to prevent its profanation by those who sought only its destruction. The fate of that chest, whether it successfully reached Baghdad and fueled the Islamic Golden Age, or was simply lost in the sands of the Silk Road, remains the greatest open question in the history of science.
Beyond the quantifiable losses in science and technology, the Library of Alexandria contained vast collections of aesthetic, poetic, and musical theory, whose destruction impoverished the artistic and philosophical development of the Western world. The scholars of the Museion, steeped in Pythagorean and Platonic traditions, believed that true beauty, whether in architecture, music, or poetry, was rooted in divine mathematical ratios and perfect geometry. The library held the complete theoretical treatises exploring these concepts. We lost the definitive works on ancient musical theory, the scrolls detailing the precise mathematics of harmony, tuning systems far more complex than the simple octaves and fifths that survived, and the complete works of ancient composers. These texts likely described how music could be used not merely for entertainment, but as a therapeutic and even spiritual tool, capable of influencing mood, enhancing memory, and achieving states of transcendental contemplation. The understanding of the mathematical linkage between music and cosmology, the Musica Universalis, or harmony of the spheres, was detailed in these scrolls. When they were destroyed, Western music reverted to a much simpler, less theoretically grounded form, spending centuries struggling to recover the harmonic depth that was commonplace in the Ptolemaic courts. The knowledge became forbidden because the profound connection between art and science was deemed heretical by those who preferred a spiritual realm separate from rational measurement. The loss of poetry and dramatic literature is equally profound. The library's collection included the complete works of the classical Greek playwrights, including dozens of lost tragedies by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides that we now know only by title. Also vanished were the complete works of lyric poets like Sappho, whose surviving fragments hint at a mastery of emotional and formal expression that remains unsurpassed.
The library specialized in the meticulous collection of all variations and editions of these works, allowing scholars to establish the definitive, canonical versions. The destruction of this reservoir means that the texts we possess today are often corrupt, fragmented, or incomplete. The loss here is not just cultural. It is a loss of human emotional and philosophical vocabulary, depriving later generations of crucial insights into the psychological complexity of the classical mind. Furthermore, the library contained the theoretical foundations of advanced optics and perspective, knowledge that greatly influenced Hellenistic painting and architectural design. These lost treatises detailed the use of linear perspective and light to create hyper-realistic visual effects, secrets later lost and only rediscovered by Renaissance masters like Leonardo da Vinci and Brunelleschi. The fact that the Museion itself was an integrated research institution meant that the mathematicians were collaborating directly with the architects and artists, a cross-disciplinary approach that produced works of art founded on rigorous scientific proofs. The subsequent intellectual segregation in the Dark Ages was a direct consequence of the loss of these crucial interdisciplinary scrolls, making the knowledge of combining art and science forbidden by historical fragmentation.
The destruction of the library carried with it the systematic annihilation of the most advanced knowledge in ancient material science and practical chemistry, secrets that would have radically altered the subsequent technological history of the medieval world. Alexandria was the global epicenter for proto-chemistry, known as chemia, which was a meticulous blending of Egyptian metallurgical traditions and Greek theoretical inquiry. The library held unique, comprehensive treatises detailing the precise methods for creating advanced metal alloys, including complex forms of bronze, durable iron compositions, and even forms of highly resilient steel that often surpassed the quality achievable in Europe for another 1,000 years. The true forbidden knowledge here lay in the recipes for non-ferrous metal manipulation and the secrets of durable, vibrant dyes and pigments. The library's scrolls likely detailed the precise temperatures, mixtures, and atmospheric conditions required to create the legendary Tyrian purple, a dye so expensive and color-fast that it became the exclusive sign of Roman royalty. More remarkably, these texts likely contained the manufacturing secrets for Alexandrian glass, known for its clarity, vibrant colors, and unique ability to be cut with extreme precision. The loss of these detailed technical manuals meant that the ability to mass-produce high-quality materials vanished. Later societies were left with simpler, inferior chemical processes, forcing artisans and builders to operate with reduced material capabilities, creating a significant technological bottleneck that characterized the Dark Ages. Furthermore, historians speculate that the library may have housed knowledge related to proto-electricity and galvanic technology. While the famous Baghdad battery suggests knowledge of generating small electrical currents existed, the Alexandrian engineers, with their advanced understanding of chemistry and mechanics, may have gone further. The lost texts could have detailed systems for electroplating, depositing a thin layer of gold onto a cheaper metal, or even large-scale electrolysis for separating metals. This knowledge, which could not be explained by the simple physics of the day, would have been quickly categorized as magic or demonic sorcery by later, less scientifically literate cultures, leading to its mandatory destruction or zealous concealment. The fear of controlling the invisible forces of nature made this powerful knowledge truly forbidden. The legacy of this loss is a world where artisans and builders spent centuries relying on guesswork and fragmented oral traditions instead of the rigorous, documented scientific methodology preserved in Alexandria.
The library's destruction did not just erase books, it eradicated the scientific blueprint for industrial-level material perfection, ensuring that the world had to wait until the Enlightenment to rediscover the basic laws of chemical synthesis once understood on the banks of the Nile.
The destruction of the library carried with it the systematic annihilation of the most advanced knowledge in ancient material science and practical chemistry, secrets that would have radically altered the subsequent technological history of the medieval world. Alexandria was the global epicenter for protochemistry, known as chemia, which was a meticulous blending of Egyptian metallurgical traditions and Greek theoretical inquiry. The library held unique, comprehensive treatises detailing the precise methods for creating advanced metal alloys, including complex forms of bronze, durable iron compositions, and even forms of highly resilient steel that often surpassed the quality achievable in Europe for another 1,000 years. The true forbidden knowledge here lay in the recipes for non-ferrous metal manipulation and the secrets of durable, vibrant dyes and pigments. The library's scrolls likely detailed the precise temperatures, mixtures, and atmospheric conditions required to create the legendary Tyrian purple, a dye so expensive and color-fast that it became the exclusive sign of Roman royalty. More remarkably, these texts likely contained the manufacturing secrets for Alexandrian glass, known for its clarity, vibrant colors, and unique ability to be cut with extreme precision. The loss of these detailed technical manuals meant that the ability to mass-produce high-quality materials vanished. Later societies were left with simpler, inferior chemical processes, forcing artisans and builders to operate with reduced material capabilities, creating a significant technological bottleneck that characterized the Dark Ages. Furthermore, historians speculate that the library may have housed knowledge related to proto-electricity and galvanic technology. While the famous Baghdad battery suggests knowledge of generating small electrical currents existed, the Alexandrian engineers, with their advanced understanding of chemistry and mechanics, may have gone further. The lost texts could have detailed systems for electroplating, depositing a thin layer of gold onto a cheaper metal, or even large-scale electrolysis for separating metals. This knowledge, which could not be explained by the simple physics of the day, would have been quickly categorized as magic or demonic sorcery by later, less scientifically literate cultures, leading to its mandatory destruction or zealous concealment. The fear of controlling the invisible forces of nature made this powerful knowledge truly forbidden. The legacy of this loss is a world where artisans and builders spent centuries relying on guesswork and fragmented oral traditions instead of the rigorous, documented scientific methodology preserved in Alexandria. The library's destruction did not just erase books, it eradicated the scientific blueprint for industrial-level material perfection, ensuring that the world had to wait until the Enlightenment to rediscover the basic laws of chemical synthesis once understood on the banks of the Nile.
A vital yet often overlooked category of the library's forbidden knowledge relates to the comprehensive sciences of agriculture, botany, and pharmacology. Texts that were essential for sustaining the enormous urban population of Alexandria and the vast Ptolemaic kingdom. The Museion held specialized treatises that documented centuries of collected knowledge on optimizing crop yields, managing large-scale irrigation systems, critical for the Nile Delta, and combating crop diseases. These scrolls detailed highly sophisticated techniques for soil analysis, advanced fertilization, and complex crop rotation systems that were far superior to the rudimentary farming practices employed in post-Roman Europe. The loss of these specialized agricultural manuals led directly to a decline in food production efficiency in the Romanized world, contributing to widespread famine and instability. The forbidden nature of this knowledge was not religious, but practical and localized. The scrolls held the unique, context-specific secrets of sustainable arid agriculture, how to manage salinity, when to flood the fields for maximum nutrient deposition,
and how to breed drought-resistant strains of wheat and barley. When this geographically essential knowledge was destroyed or rendered unreadable due to the language barriers following the Greek decline, the successor kingdoms lacked the technical skill to maintain such high population densities, resulting in demographic collapse and the abandonment of complex farmlands. Most tragically, the library housed the most complete collection of pharmacological and botanical guides ever assembled in antiquity. These were not mere lists of herbs, but meticulously illustrated volumes documenting thousands of medicinal plants, their precise geographical sources, methods of extraction, and exact dosages for treating everything from chronic pain to infectious diseases. Figures like Dioscorides, though known for his surviving work on Materia Medica, likely drew upon a vastly larger, lost corpus of Alexandrian pharmacological research. The destruction of these comprehensive reference works meant that the knowledge of numerous effective ancient treatments was obliterated. As a result, later medieval medicine reverted to often ineffective herbalism and superstition, having lost the detailed scientific methodology and precise recipes that only the library had preserved. The final, chilling implication of this loss is that the eradication of these botanical and medical texts directly contributed to the exacerbation of human suffering and mortality throughout the Dark Ages. The knowledge was forbidden because it offered practical, rational solutions to the fundamental problems of existence, hunger and disease, problems that, when left unchecked, dramatically reduced the quality and length of life for succeeding generations. The library's scrolls were not just academic, they were the operating manual for sustained, healthy life, and their destruction was an existential blow to the future populations of the West.
To truly grasp the concept of forbidden knowledge in Alexandria, we must venture into the realm of the spiritual and the esoteric. The library and its surrounding scholarly community were the birthplace of profound religious syncretism, blending Greek philosophy, Egyptian theology, and emerging Jewish and early Christian thought. The scrolls housed the complete, unedited texts of Gnosticism and Hermeticism, philosophical and mystical traditions that claimed direct, secret knowledge, gnosis, of the divine, accessible through esoteric learning and personal revelation, rather than through public doctrine or established priesthoods. The Gnostics, whose writings were heavily collected by the library, proposed a complex cosmology involving a distant, perfect God and a lesser, flawed creator god, the Demiurge, who mistakenly fashioned the material world. These texts often claimed that humanity's spiritual prison was the physical body itself, and that salvation lay in escaping this material realm through secret knowledge. Similarly, the Hermetic texts, attributed to the mythical sage Hermes Trismegistus, contained treatises on astrology, alchemy, and theurgy, the practice of compelling or communing with benevolent spirits. These texts offered a rationalized, philosophical framework for magic, claiming that the trained human mind could manipulate the fabric of the cosmos using precise spiritual and physical formulas. This body of mystical yet highly intellectual literature became the most violently forbidden category of knowledge in late antiquity. To the nascent, institutionally focused Christian church, these texts were a direct existential threat. They challenged the necessity of the church's priesthood, the efficacy of the established sacraments, and the singular authority of the revealed biblical narrative. Gnosticism was seen as a dangerous, elitist philosophy that undermined the unity and simple mass appeal message of the Orthodox faith. Consequently, when religious purges began in the 4th century, the scrolls containing these mystical philosophies were specifically targeted for total annihilation. Unlike astronomical or medical texts, which were simply neglected, the Gnostic and Hermetic scrolls were actively hunted down and burned, often with their readers.
The destruction of these esoteric libraries was the successful effort to monopolize the spiritual truth. The few Gnostic and Hermetic texts that survived, such as the Nag Hammadi library found centuries later in Egypt, reveal a breathtaking complexity of thought, suggesting that the vast Alexandrian collection contained even more radical and sophisticated spiritual philosophies. The true forbidden knowledge, therefore, was the philosophical key to personal, unmediated divinity, which offered spiritual freedom outside the control of any earthly authority. Its loss ensured that spiritual authority remained centralized, and the intricate pluralistic cosmos of ancient Alexandria was replaced by a more constrained, monolithic worldview.
The deepest strata of the library's lost knowledge, the truly forbidden knowledge, may have concerned the mastery of the human mind itself. Alexandrian scholars, combining the psychological theories of Greek philosophy with the hypnotic and ritualistic practices of Egyptian religion, were rumored to have compiled treatises on advanced rhetoric, memory palace techniques, mnemonics, and, most alarmingly, systematic methods of persuasion and behavioral influence. These texts, if they existed in their complete form, would represent the ultimate forbidden power, the ability to control the will of men and shape mass reality through language and suggestion alone. This leads us to an eccentric and frightening possibility that some knowledge was not lost to fire or purge, but was deliberately concealed by the scholars themselves, deemed too dangerous for humanity. This is the story of Zosimus of Panopolis, a historical alchemist and writer from Alexandria, whose real work on chemistry was often intertwined with mystical and spiritual philosophy. Let us imagine Zosimus not just as a chemist, but as a keeper of the library's most dangerous secrets, specifically the Scroll of Unmaking. This scroll, unlike the engineering texts or the poetry, held the complete, terrifying secrets of perfect rhetoric. It detailed the precise linguistic structures, tonal frequencies, and psychological triggers necessary to bypass a listener's rational defenses and implant an idea directly into their subconscious mind, rendering the recipient utterly compliant. The scroll was not magic, but pure, applied neurological science. The scholars of the Museion in the late Roman period allegedly subjected this scroll to rigorous testing. They realized its potential was not for governance or education, but for total tyranny. A single orator, armed with the scroll's knowledge, could incite mass frenzy, start wars, or dissolve the collective will of an entire nation with mere words. Zosimus and the last surviving fellows, bound by an ancient solemn scholars' pact, made a decision unprecedented in intellectual history. They would forbid the knowledge themselves. The story goes that Zosimus did not burn the scroll. Burning it would risk its secret being whispered by the smoke. Instead, he encased it in a heavy lead sarcophagus, not unlike an ancient chemical container, and buried it vertically in a highly specific location in the deepest, most unstable foundation layer of the Museion. This act of burial was simultaneously an act of intentional preservation and eternal sealing. They placed the scroll in the most seismically volatile part of the city, ensuring that any future attempt to retrieve it would risk the structural collapse of the entire area, including the encroaching Christian churches and later Arab buildings. The true forbidden knowledge, therefore, is protected not by fire or zealotry, but by a pact of human conscience and the perpetual threat of architectural collapse, a secret held hostage by the physics of the earth itself, waiting for the day a future generation, more ethical or more ruthless, finally dares to disturb the foundation of the world.
The destruction of the library inflicted an enduring wound on the development of political science and the philosophy of governance. The Museion, as the intellectual center of the vast Ptolemaic kingdom, housed an unparalleled collection of texts dedicated to the analysis of political systems, state administration, and early sociological models. This forbidden knowledge was not mystical but intensely practical. The accumulated objective wisdom on how to successfully build, manage, and prevent the collapse of complex human societies. The library meticulously collected and analyzed the constitutions and political histories of hundreds of Greek city-states, federations, and ancient monarchies. Aristotle, Alexander the Great's teacher, famously compiled 158 studies of Greek constitutions, but the Alexandrian scholars expanded upon this, documenting the successes and, crucially, the systemic failures of empires like the Persian Achaemenids, the Phoenician maritime states, and various short-lived republics. The loss of these comprehensive comparative political studies meant that subsequent rulers in the Roman and medieval eras were denied access to a massive historical database of effective and ineffective governance strategies. Instead of learning from centuries of recorded political experimentation, later European states were forced to rely on fragmented philosophical theories and simplistic hereditary models, resulting in centuries of political instability and inefficient administration. Furthermore, the library contained advanced theoretical treatises on the concept of the ideal state that went far beyond the well-known works of Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Politics. These lost works likely detailed mathematical and sociological models for optimizing public welfare, managing complex urban demographics, critical for massive Alexandria, and designing equitable legal systems. The true forbidden nature of this knowledge lay in its inherent secularism and rationalism. These texts proposed that societal success was the result of measurable, observable laws of human nature and administration, not divine right or religious decree. For later religiously justified monarchies, the idea of a purely rational, scientifically managed state, a state where accountability and efficiency were paramount, was an ideological threat, leading to the intentional neglect or quiet suppression of the foundational texts that promoted such secular political engineering. The loss of these political and sociological archives meant that the subsequent 1,000 years were marked by political illiteracy. Rulers struggled to manage finance, infrastructure, and multi-ethnic populations with systems far less sophisticated than those documented and analyzed in the Alexandrian scrolls. The forbidden knowledge of statecraft was the empirical evidence that sound governance is a science built on historical data, a principle the world had to painfully rediscover through trial and error over millennia.
The most tangible evidence of the regression caused by the library's destruction lies in the loss of comprehensive knowledge regarding ancient urban planning and advanced infrastructure design. Alexandria itself was a marvel of planning, conceived by Dinocrates of Rhodes under Alexander the Great's direction and perfected by the Ptolemies. The library housed the complete engineering blueprints, theoretical treatises, and maintenance logs for this complex urban system, a knowledge base utterly erased from the Western world. This forbidden knowledge included the precise architectural and hydrological secrets for managing a massive city built on a low-lying delta. These scrolls detailed the construction and maintenance of sophisticated freshwater and sewage systems, massive subterranean networks of cisterns, conduits, and drainage tunnels that kept the metropolitan center sanitary and supplied, a feat largely unachieved in European cities for over 1,000 years following the Roman decline. The meticulous planning outlined in these lost texts ensured that sewage was channeled away from fresh water sources and the harbor, maintaining a level of public health that later medieval cities could only dream of. The subsequent diseases and plagues that ravaged medieval Europe were arguably facilitated by the loss of Alexandrian public health engineering. More crucially, the library contained the engineering principles behind advanced harbor and coastal management. Alexandria's twin harbors were masterpieces of marine engineering, requiring constant dredging, complex breakwater construction, and precise tidal modeling to remain functional. The technical manuals detailed in the library's collection explained the mathematics of wave dynamics, the construction of hydraulic cement superior to later Roman recipes, and the methods for building earthquake-resistant foundations in the unstable delta soil. The loss of this applied marine and civil engineering meant that the ability to construct or even maintain large, sophisticated port facilities vanished from the West, severely hindering maritime trade and contributing to economic isolation. The disappearance of these civic engineering archives underscores that the knowledge was forbidden not by religious decree, but by a lack of political stability and technical continuity. The sheer scale and complexity of managing a metropolis like Alexandria required a dedicated, mathematically literate bureaucracy, the kind of intellectual infrastructure that crumbled entirely in the centuries following the Roman collapse. The library's engineering scrolls were the operating manual for a truly sustainable, healthy, and high-functioning city, a manual that was tragically lost, forcing subsequent generations to endure cramped, unsanitary, and structurally vulnerable urban environments for centuries.
The greatest casualty of the library's demise was not a single scroll, but the very methodology of rational inquiry itself. The Alexandrian tradition was defined by its commitment to empiricism, the belief that knowledge should be derived from rigorous observation, experimentation, and dissection, rather than solely from philosophical tradition or religious revelation. The library was the physical embodiment of this Hellenistic rationalism, a place where astronomers like Aristarchus calculated the cosmos from data, where doctors like Herophilus learned the human body by dissection, and where engineers like Hero built machines based on physical laws. The destruction of the library, spanning from Caesar's fire to the later religious purges, created an intellectual vacuum that allowed a fundamentally different methodology, scholasticism and reliance on authority, to take root in the succeeding medieval period. The forbidden knowledge was, in essence, the very scientific method itself, stripped of its protective scaffolding, the library and the Mauseon. With the systematic loss of primary empirical data, the anatomical drawings, the precise astronomical tables, and the records of controlled mechanical experiments, scholars in the West were forced to rely on fragmented summaries, secondary philosophical interpretations, and, increasingly, on unchallenged theological dogma. This shift was profound. Where Alexandrian scholars had debated the mechanisms of the universe, later scholars debated the intentions of the Creator as interpreted through accepted religious texts. The knowledge became forbidden not by active decree, but by the elimination of the tools of verification. Without the detailed empirical Alexandrian records, new inquiries could not be properly verified, and thus intellectual progress stalled. The accurate heliocentric model of Aristarchus was rejected not because it was demonstrably wrong, but because the foundational mathematics and observational proofs were lost, leaving only the simpler church-sanctioned geocentric model, derived from Ptolemy's modified surviving summaries, as the accepted authority. The result was a prolonged period where dogma replaced observation as the highest form of truth. Scientific inquiry became subservient to theological requirements, leading to centuries of intellectual stagnation, where advancements in fields like medicine and astronomy were stifled. The library's destruction was an intellectual cataclysm that severed the essential continuity of the empirical tradition, marking the definitive moment when the age of scientific exploration gave way to the age of faith. The forbidden knowledge was simply the uncomfortable truth that humans could discover the deepest secrets of the universe through their own intellect, without the necessary intervention of spiritual authority.
The forbidden knowledge of the library extended critically into the foundational principles of proto-economics, complex finance, and banking. The Ptolemaic state was arguably the most centralized and meticulously managed economy of the ancient world, relying on sophisticated accounting, currency stabilization, and state-controlled monopolies. The library's technical collection included the complete, comprehensive manuals detailing the operational mechanisms of this economic machine, knowledge that was utterly lost and whose absence contributed directly to the financial chaos of late antiquity. These lost economic texts detailed the intricate art of currency management, explaining the precise ratios of gold, silver, and base metals necessary to maintain monetary stability across a vast empire. The Ptolemies possessed sophisticated theoretical knowledge of inflation control and the use of government debt and reserves, all meticulously documented in the Museion scrolls. The loss of these theoretical economic models meant that when later Roman and medieval empires faced monetary crises, they resorted to chaotic currency debasement and lacked the organized financial wisdom to restore stability, leading to centuries of disruptive economic cycles and general impoverishment. The knowledge was forbidden because it revealed the mechanical, non-spiritual mechanisms of wealth creation and maintenance. Furthermore, the library housed the complete archives of international trade and maritime law. As the nexus of global commerce, Alexandria maintained detailed records of complex multi-party trade agreements stretching from the Mediterranean to India. These scrolls would have included foundational legal treatises on contract enforcement, insurance, and interest calculation, the very tools necessary for large-scale, low-risk global commerce. The destruction of these legal and commercial archives led to a systemic loss of confidence in international trade and contributed to the fragmentation of global markets. The early medieval period saw a retreat into localized barter systems precisely because the sophisticated financial and legal infrastructure documented in the library was annihilated. The economic knowledge was forbidden not by direct command, but by the collapse of the bureaucratic structure that could read, interpret, and implement it. The complexity of Ptolemaic accounting required highly specialized, mathematically trained scribes and administrators. When the educational apparatus of the Museion collapsed, the language of advanced finance became unintelligible, transforming the most practical texts on economic stability into an unreadable script of ancient complexity. The resulting era of financial stagnation was a direct, devastating consequence of losing the ancient world's most advanced economic operating manual, ensuring that progress in finance, the very engine of civilization, was stalled for 1,000 years.
The erased histories of lost civilizations, the Library of Alexandria was more than a Greco-Roman repository. It was the world's foremost center for ethnography and comparative cultural studies. The Ptolemies, driven by intellectual curiosity and political expediency, commissioned and acquired primary source materials detailing the histories, languages, customs, and technologies of civilizations that today are either poorly understood or entirely vanished from the historical record. The loss of these unique anthropological archives has left colossal, unfillable blind spots in our understanding of global antiquity. This forbidden knowledge included exhaustive records and translations related to the sophisticated Meroic civilization, ancient Kush, south of Egypt, including detailed histories of their royal succession, their unique hieroglyphic script, which remains largely undeciphered today, and their advanced metallurgy. The library's scholars likely possessed the Rosetta Stone-like keys to fully translating Meroic. The destruction of these texts severed that crucial linguistic link, ensuring that the history of a powerful African kingdom remains largely a mystery.
The library scrolls held not only the history of the conquerors, but the complete empathetic histories of the conquered and the neighbors. Furthermore, the library contained unique reports from the outermost edges of the Hellenistic world, including detailed accounts of the Indian subcontinent, records of trade with the Chinese Han Dynasty, and extensive ethnographic studies of the African interior and the nomadic tribes of Central Asia. These were not just travelogues, they were scholarly attempts to understand foreign legal systems, religious practices, and military tactics. The loss of this vast collection of global ethnography means that our understanding of interactions between ancient superpowers, such as the exact nature of cultural exchange between the Mauryan Empire and the Hellenistic kingdoms, is based on frustratingly fragmented secondary sources. The knowledge became forbidden because it contradicted the simplified Eurocentric worldview that solidified in the later Roman and medieval periods. As the West retreated into itself, the idea of sophisticated, powerful, and scientifically advanced civilizations existing beyond the Mediterranean was increasingly ignored or dismissed as mythical. The library's comprehensive record of global pluralism, the evidence that knowledge and power were distributed across dozens of cultures, was incompatible with the centralized monolithic ideology of the succeeding era. The destruction of these ethnographic archives effectively shrank the intellectual map of the world, ensuring that the rich, complex tapestry of global antiquity was frayed beyond repair, leaving us today with an incomplete, biased, and impoverished historical narrative.
The intellectual riches of the library extended into the highly specialized and secretarial fields of advanced linguistic science and cryptography. The Ptolemaic court, being a multi-ethnic, multilingual administration, required sophisticated tools to manage its vast bureaucracy, translating between Greek, Demotic Egyptian, Aramaic, and numerous other languages used across its dominion. The library was the central hub for this linguistic knowledge, and the loss of its archives created an irreparable fracture in the later study of ancient communication. This forbidden knowledge included comprehensive polyglot dictionaries and comparative grammars, meticulously compiled over centuries, which provided direct translation keys between languages now difficult or impossible to fully decipher. For instance, the library possessed texts essential for understanding the transition from the archaic hieroglyphic script to the later Demotic and Coptic scripts, knowledge that allowed scholars to read the full, chronological record of pharaonic history. The loss of these unique linguistic cross-references dramatically slowed the later decipherment efforts, leaving massive gaps in our understanding of pre-Hellenistic civilizations. The destruction of this knowledge meant that the ability to read the past was itself annihilated. More intriguing still, the library likely housed advanced texts on cryptography and military ciphers. Managing a large empire required the secure transmission of state secrets, military commands, and sensitive financial data. The scholars of the Mausean, leveraging their mathematical prowess, would have developed sophisticated substitution and transposition ciphers, far surpassing the simple techniques known to have survived, like the basic Caesar cipher. These texts, detailing the art of creating and breaking complex codes, would have been highly restricted state secrets. The loss of these cryptographic manuals meant that subsequent medieval administrations lacked the theoretical framework for developing truly secure, complex ciphers, leaving them vulnerable to espionage and information breaches. The reason this linguistic and cryptographic knowledge became forbidden was inherently political. It was the knowledge of state control and ideological authority. The ability to read, translate, and communicate secrets securely was the engine of Ptolemaic power. Once that power structure dissolved, the technical manuals that supported it were either seized and permanently sequestered by successor powers, or were simply allowed to decay because the complex skills required to maintain the system had vanished. The library's linguistic archives were the final, physical proof that the power of an empire rests not just on its armies, but on its ability to master the flow and meaning of information, a profound truth that was buried along with the scrolls.
Among the most devastating and least mythologized losses of the Library of Alexandria was the complete annihilation of its historical archives and primary source documents. The Mauseon served as the official repository for the Ptolemaic dynasty, meaning it housed not just literature, but the raw, unedited, and highly sensitive records of state, the true, unfiltered knowledge of power. This loss is critical because it forces modern historians to view vast swaths of antiquity through a dense secondary filter, leading to perpetual debate and fundamental historical distortions. The library held the original royal diaries and official correspondence from the court of Alexander the Great and his immediate successors, the Diadochi. Imagine the scrolls containing the personal, daily records of Alexander's campaigns, written by his secretary, Eumenes of Cardia, or the complete, detailed letters between Ptolemy I Soter and his fellow generals. These texts offered direct, unmediated access to the intentions, strategies, and psychological makeup of the figures who shaped the Hellenistic world. Their destruction meant that our primary source for Alexander's life is now based on later, often biased, Roman-era biographers like Plutarch and Arrian, who are writing centuries after the events and relying on selective and filtered copies. The forbidden knowledge here was the objective truth of the founders of the Hellenistic era, a truth lost to political filtering and time. Furthermore, the library possessed the complete archival records of the Ptolemaic economy, administration, and military expenditures. These detailed, meticulous ledgers and census data would have allowed historians and sociologists to accurately reconstruct the demographics, wealth distribution, and public policy of a high-functioning ancient state. Without these primary documents, our understanding of the Ptolemaic period is based almost entirely on fragmented papyri and inscriptions, preventing any comprehensive, scientifically sound analysis of their societal models. The economic and political secrets of their 3-century reign, how they managed ethnic diversity, controlled the grain supply, and maintained unparalleled naval power, are now reduced to guesswork. The nature of this loss is particularly chilling. It was the annihilation of context. The loss of these primary source archives ensured that the complex political and social realities of the Hellenistic world were simplified into digestible narratives suitable for later imperial propaganda. The library's vast, impartial documentation of what actually happened was replaced by narratives of what later powers wanted to believe had happened. The archives became forbidden knowledge not because they held a dangerous invention, but because they held the uncomfortable complexity of history, allowing the clean, simple narrative of dogma to replace the messy, objective reality of the past.
Among the most technically advanced bodies of knowledge lost from the Library of Alexandria were the comprehensive treatises on optics, the physics of light, and applied lens technology. The Alexandrian school built upon the foundational work of Euclid's optics, which dealt primarily with geometry and perspective, and developed sophisticated theories concerning refraction, reflection, and the manipulation of light far beyond what survived into the medieval era. The loss of these texts crippled subsequent scientific efforts to understand vision, create powerful astronomical instruments, and utilize light as a practical tool. The library likely housed the complete theoretical and manufacturing manuals for advanced lenses and mirrors.
While we know the ancients possessed glassworking technology, the lost scrolls would have detailed the precise mathematical curves and polishing techniques required to create lenses capable of serious magnification. This loss is tragic because it potentially delayed the invention of the telescope and the microscope by well over 1,000 years. Had this knowledge survived, Alexandrian astronomers would have been equipped with instruments allowing them to gather visual data that would have definitively proven the heliocentric model of Aristarchus, potentially rendering the medieval conflict over the nature of the cosmos entirely moot. The forbidden knowledge here was the visual key to the universe, a set of blueprints that would have revealed celestial and microscopic worlds centuries before their time.
The Library of Alexandria's destruction guaranteed the loss of the most sensitive and strategically vital technical manuals concerning advanced metallurgy and weaponry design. These were the absolute state secrets of the Ptolemaic military machine, the knowledge base that provided them with a tactical advantage over their rivals for centuries. The true forbidden knowledge in this domain was not the basic instruction for forging iron, but the specific, complex chemical and thermal formulas for creating materials of superior strength and durability. The scrolls likely contained the complete, detailed recipes for manufacturing corrosion-resistant metals and specialized steel alloys used in high-performance military hardware, particularly in their massive siege engines and naval fleets. The Ptolemies possessed a sophisticated understanding of how to introduce specific elements to iron and bronze, achieving alloys that were lighter, harder, and less susceptible to rust and fatigue than anything produced in the subsequent centuries. The disappearance of these technical metallurgical treatises meant that later Roman and Byzantine empires, and later the medieval kingdoms, were continually forced to innovate from a baseline of significantly reduced technical knowledge. The very definition of the Dark Ages military technology, characterized by heavy, often inefficient siegecraft and brittle armor, is a direct historical consequence of the burning of the library's detailed scientific blueprints for warfare. The forbidden knowledge of the ultimate offense and defense remains one of the most powerful and chilling secrets buried beneath the sands of Alexandria.
A largely underestimated area of irreparable loss from the Library of Alexandria concerns the sophisticated knowledge of ancient meteorology, climate science, and long-term environmental forecasting. The survival of the Ptolemaic kingdom, dependent entirely on the predictable yet often volatile annual flooding of the Nile River, necessitated a rigorous, scientific approach to understanding atmospheric and hydrological patterns. The library held the accumulated, centuries-long records that underpinned this vital knowledge. This forbidden knowledge included comprehensive Nile flood records, detailed logs spanning generations that allowed Alexandrian scholars to predict the optimal timing and expected height of the annual inundation with uncanny accuracy. These records, combined with advanced theoretical treatises on atmospheric pressure, prevailing winds, and rainfall cycles across the Mediterranean and Ethiopian highlands, formed a sophisticated basis for agricultural planning, disaster preparedness, and taxation policy. The subsequent loss of this meticulous, long-term climate data meant that later governments, lacking this empirical foresight, were frequently caught unprepared by severe droughts or catastrophic floods, leading directly to famine, economic ruin, and political upheaval. The knowledge was forbidden because it offered a rational, scientific control over uncertainty, a function that later societies preferred to assign to divine providence. Furthermore, the library likely housed early radical theoretical models on climatology and geographical influences on weather.
Scholars may have documented the long-term impact of deforestation, irrigation, and urbanization on local weather patterns, establishing a rudimentary understanding of human-induced environmental change. These texts were based on an unprecedented volume of observational data gathered by astronomers, sailors, and military surveyors across the Hellenistic world. The obliteration of this dataset, the raw, empirical proof of climate mechanisms, forced later scholars to rely on simple, localized weather folklore and astrological correlation, delaying the genuine scientific study of the atmosphere until the early modern period. The significance of this loss transcends mere academic setback. It represents the eradication of a vital component of societal resilience. The Alexandrian knowledge of meteorology and hydrology was the scientific insurance policy against catastrophic natural events. Its destruction left the succeeding world blind to the subtle yet powerful cycles of nature, contributing to a prolonged period of vulnerability and instability. The forbidden knowledge here was the scientific foresight that allowed a civilization to harmonize with, rather than merely suffer under, the forces of its environment. The library, therefore, holds the secrets to understanding not only the stars above us, but the very air and water that sustain us, a knowledge that remains tragically out of reach.
The loss of the Library of Alexandria extends deeply into the very foundations of human ethics, morality, and the philosophy of law. The Hellenistic period was defined by a rich, continuous, and highly competitive debate between numerous philosophical schools: Stoicism, Epicureanism, Cynicism, and academic skepticism, each offering a comprehensive, rational guide to the good life and the just society. The library housed the complete, unedited, and often contradictory texts of these schools, fostering an environment of ethical pluralism that was utterly extinguished by the library's demise. This forbidden knowledge included the full, nuanced works of the Stoic philosophers like Zeno and Chrysippus, who detailed a rigorous system of ethics based on universal reason, natural law, and self-mastery. While fragments survived through later Roman summaries, the library possessed the original, comprehensive treatises explaining their complete physics and logic, which were intrinsically linked to their moral teachings. The destruction of these foundational texts meant that later periods inherited only a partial, often simplified version of Stoic thought, hindering the development of a fully rational and secular system of universal jurisprudence in the West. Equally devastating was the loss of the complete works of the Epicureans, whose philosophy advocated for the pursuit of tranquility, ataraxia, and the absence of pain, often through rational understanding and a materialist view of the universe, atomism. Epicureanism, with its rejection of divine intervention and its emphasis on rational pleasure, became one of the most vigorously forbidden doctrines by the later religious establishment, which viewed its secular materialism as inherently immoral and dangerous. The original scrolls containing their powerful arguments against superstition and fear were systematically destroyed, forcing the world to endure a millennium dominated by anxiety and spiritual terror. The subsequent void in ethical debate was filled by a singular, less challenged theological morality. The destruction of the library's diverse ethical collection meant that succeeding generations were denied the opportunity to engage in a continuous, critical debate among competing rational moral frameworks. The ethical knowledge became forbidden because its plurality threatened the unity and singular authority of the dominant religious worldview.
The library, therefore, was the final resting place of intellectual freedom in ethics, a place where the truth about human nature and morality was sought through reason and evidence, not through unexamined faith. The world that followed was forced to rebuild its ethical foundation on a much narrower, less flexible basis, slowing the long march toward modern pluralistic societies and secular law.
One of the most profound and unsettling categories of the library's forbidden knowledge was the pioneering work in medical psychology and neuroscience. The Alexandrian School of Medicine, led by figures like Herophilus and Erasistratus, was unique in the ancient world for its sanctioned practice of human dissection, which allowed for an unprecedented understanding of the brain and the nervous system. The complete texts detailing these discoveries were housed in the Mauseon, only to be utterly lost. The library's anatomical scrolls contained the most detailed and accurate descriptions of the human brain, nerves, and spinal cord available in antiquity. Herophilus was the first to recognize that the brain, not the heart, was the center of intellect and reason, and he meticulously distinguished between motor and sensory nerves. This empirical understanding formed the foundation for a rational rather than mystical approach to mental health and neurological disorders. The Alexandrian physicians treated mental illnesses like epilepsy, depression, and hysteria as physical ailments of the brain, utilizing pharmaceutical, dietary, and early forms of cognitive therapies. This sophisticated biological approach was centuries ahead of its time. The subsequent loss of this knowledge was devastating. When human dissection became religiously and politically forbidden in the Roman and medieval eras, the empirical study of the brain ceased. The detailed Alexandrian anatomical texts were destroyed or disappeared, and medical practice reverted to relying on flawed Galenic dogma based on animal dissection and, tragically, on spiritual explanations for mental illness. The knowledge became forbidden because it offered a secular biological explanation for the mind, an explanation that contradicted the emerging theological framework which categorized mental illness as demonic possession or moral failure. This reversal had catastrophic consequences for human welfare. For over 1,000 years, individuals suffering from neurological and psychological disorders were subjected to exorcisms, persecution, and often torture rather than rational medical care. The Alexandrian scrolls held the key to the humane and scientific treatment of the mind, a key that was deliberately thrown away. The library's destruction was an act of intellectual regression that ensured the brain, the very seat of human knowledge and reason, remained a forbidden, poorly understood territory, locking humanity into the dark ages of psychiatry and neuroscience until the Renaissance finally began the painful process of rediscovery.
A cornerstone of the library's technological collection, representing some of the most purely empirical forbidden knowledge, lay in the comprehensive treatises on hydraulic and pneumatic technology. The Alexandrian engineers, notably Ctesibius and Hero, were masters of fluid mechanics, moving far beyond simple practical applications into the realm of theoretical physics applied to complex machinery. The complete texts detailing these theories were unique to the Mauseon, and their disappearance guaranteed a technological regression in water and air management for centuries. The library housed the foundational works that explained the physics of pressure, vacuum, and the conservation of fluid energy. These scrolls contained the blueprints for highly efficient, massive water-lifting devices, complex pumps, fire engines, and mechanisms for raising water to great heights,
crucial for maintaining Alexandria's elevated fresh water supply and large agricultural estates. These were not primitive tools, but scientifically engineered machines built using principles of pressure differential and precise valve technology. The loss of these engineering manuals meant that later Roman and Byzantine attempts to maintain complex aqueducts and urban water systems often relied on less efficient gravity-fed or simpler screw mechanisms, unable to replicate the sophisticated pressure systems perfected in Alexandria. Furthermore, the library preserved the secrets of pneumatic automation, the use of compressed air, heat, and water displacement to create self-operating mechanisms. Hero's surviving descriptions of automated temple doors and singing automata only scratch the surface. The full treatises would have detailed the theoretical physics required to design large-scale automated machinery. This technology, often applied to religious spectacle, the statues that wept or spoke, was viewed by later, less scientific cultures as genuine sorcery or black magic, making its underlying mathematical and engineering texts highly vulnerable to destruction during periods of religious cleansing. The knowledge was forbidden because it blurred the line between rational engineering and the miraculous, challenging the emerging supernatural worldview. The profound consequence of losing this hydraulic and pneumatic knowledge was the stalling of large-scale public works. The ability to efficiently control and move vast quantities of water was the key to maintaining massive urban populations, irrigating arid lands, and driving early industrial processes. When this knowledge was lost, civil engineering reverted to simpler, less efficient methods, ensuring that the economic and demographic capacity of the succeeding world remained dramatically reduced compared to the Hellenistic peak. The Mauseon scrolls, detailing the precise mathematical mastery of water and air, were the blueprints for civilized life, and their elimination plunged the world back into a period where the fundamental forces of nature were managed by trial and error, not by calculated science.
The library's destruction delivered a fatal blow to the field of ancient astronomy, a discipline that was central to Alexandrian science, governance, and navigation. The Museion held an unparalleled, multicultural collection of celestial observations, a vast database of astronomical data spanning centuries, integrated from Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek sources. The loss of this complete, longitudinal record created a profound and lasting ignorance about the precise mechanics of the cosmos. This forbidden knowledge included the definitive, complete works of Hipparchus of Nicaea, 2nd century BC, arguably the greatest astronomer of antiquity. Hipparchus is credited with compiling the first comprehensive star catalog, discovering the precession of the equinoxes, and developing the mathematical foundations of trigonometry specifically to analyze celestial motion. While his ideas survived in fragments cited by later scholars, the library held his original, exhaustive catalog containing the precise coordinates and brightness data for nearly 1,000 stars, based on meticulous long-term observation. The destruction of this primary star catalog meant that astronomers for the next 1,500 years lacked the crucial baseline data needed to track and accurately predict subtle celestial changes, significantly hindering the development of precise navigation and timekeeping. More critically, the library housed the complete Babylonia astronomical diaries, cuneiform records of celestial phenomena spanning nearly 1,000 years. Alexandrian scholars were unique in their ability to translate, understand, and integrate this massive empirical dataset into their Greek geometrical models. This synthesis allowed them to develop highly accurate methods for predicting eclipses and planetary movements. The loss of the Babylonian records and their Greek translations severed the intellectual link to the longest continuous astronomical tradition in human history.
Consequently, later civilizations were forced to rebuild their understanding of celestial cycles from scratch, leading to errors in calendar systems and cosmological models. The forbidden nature of this astronomical knowledge was twofold: scientific and ideological. Scientifically, the knowledge was too complex. The accurate models required data volumes and mathematical expertise that were unsustainable outside the Museon's patronage. Ideologically, the comprehensive, objective data often contradicted the simpler, symbolic interpretations of the heavens favored by late antiquity's religious syncretism. The objective truth of the stars, documented through centuries of dispassionate observation, was extinguished, replaced by a cosmology more amenable to theological doctrine. The library's destruction ensured that the secrets of the sky remained silent for generations, plunging the study of the cosmos into an era of reduced precision and stifled rational inquiry.
The most fundamental and conceptually profound loss from the Library of Alexandria was not a single book of secrets, but the doctrine of intellectual synthesis and pluralism, the methodology that allowed the library to exist in the first place. The library's true power lay in its unique, systematic method of collecting and comparing contradictory knowledge from every civilization: Greek rationalism, Egyptian ritual, Babylonian astronomy, Persian philosophy, and Indian mathematics. The scholars of the Museon understood that juxtaposing these diverse and often clashing viewpoints was the only way to achieve radical breakthroughs and reveal universal truths. This forbidden knowledge was the belief that all truths are interconnected and must be subjected to rational, cross-cultural scrutiny. The Alexandrian model was based on an intellectual humility that acknowledged no single ultimate source of authority, but rather celebrated the plurality of human wisdom. For example, a scholar might compare the Egyptian method of flood prediction with the Babylonian astronomical records, and then apply a Greek geometric model to create a superior, synthesized forecast. This methodological openness, the idea that truth is a collective, ongoing construction, was the very engine of the Hellenistic Golden Age. When the intellectual climate shifted towards monism and a singular, revealed truth in late antiquity, this doctrine of synthesis became inherently forbidden. The existence of a vast library dedicated to proving that multiple, conflicting paths to truth were valid was an existential threat to monolithic religious and political authority. The destruction of the library, therefore, was not merely the accidental burning of scrolls. It was the deliberate, systematic dismantling of the intellectual framework of pluralism. The scholars who championed this cross-cultural comparison, the very intellectual lineage of the Museon, were either silenced, dispersed, or forced into hiding, taking their comparative research with them. The resulting regression in the West was characterized by intellectual isolation and sectarian conflict. Deprived of the tools to synthesize disparate knowledge, succeeding scholars retreated into a narrow focus on texts deemed canonical by their specific religious or regional authority. The loss of the library forced the world into a kind of intellectual monoculture, where the complexity, ambiguity, and multifaceted nature of reality, the very things the Alexandrians sought to master, were violently suppressed. The true forbidden knowledge was the courage to believe in the simultaneous existence of multiple truths, a belief that was extinguished when the flames of fanaticism consumed the world's most comprehensive collection of competing ideas.
We have journeyed through the ghost archives of the Library of Alexandria, examining the shadows of knowledge that should have shaped our world. The fire that consumed the scrolls was not a single blaze, but a prolonged, tragic inferno fueled by accident, apathy, and most destructively, ideological certainty. We mourn not just the loss of the books, but the systemic annihilation of intellectual momentum. We lost the anatomical blueprints that could have prevented 1,000 years of medical error. We lost the precise star catalogs that would have unveiled the cosmos centuries earlier. We lost the advanced engineering manuals that could have ushered in an early age of automated industry and sanitation. And we lost the profound, challenging ethical pluralism that could have guided society toward greater tolerance and justice. The forbidden knowledge was not found in a single cursed tome of magic, but in the collective, synthesized truth derived from 400,000 scrolls. A truth so robust, so rational, and so complete that it was utterly incompatible with the simpler, centralized, and monolithic worldview that came to dominate the West. The knowledge became forbidden because it proved that humanity could achieve unprecedented heights through secular reason, empirical observation, and cross-cultural synthesis. By destroying the library, the world did not merely lose a collection of books, it voluntarily sacrificed the operating manual for advanced civilization, embracing instead a period of intellectual isolation and regression that cost countless lives and delayed scientific progress for over a millennium. The vacuum left by the lost scrolls was filled by superstition, dogma, and inefficiency, ensuring that the Dark Ages were indeed darker than they needed to be. Yet, the library's memory remains, not as a physical place, but as a haunting testament to human potential. Its destruction is the most powerful reminder that knowledge, once gathered, is never truly safe. The search for the library's secrets is, in the end, the search for the unrealized potential of unlived centuries. The potential for cleaner cities, more humane medicine, more stable governance, and a greater understanding of our place in the universe. The final, enduring message of Alexandria is one of profound responsibility: to fiercely guard the right to ask questions, to synthesize all forms of truth, and to acknowledge that our greatest enemy is not ignorance, but the arrogance of believing we already know enough. The lost library remains the greatest monument to the fragility of reason and the most compelling call to vigilance. The only thing we learn from the past is that we learn nothing from the past, except for the absolute necessity of keeping the lights on.